welcome back to Learning Curves. I'm Anastasia, and today we are going to do what I think is maybe the most simple project ever. Perfect for somebody who's never sewn anything before and has only seen my videos in this series up until now. That's all you know of sewing. We're going to do hand warmers. Is there a non-weird way to ask you to subscribe? So this video might feel a little weird because I thought that this was actually going to be a part of last week's video, so I shot a lot of this last week. Anyway, if I'm wearing this rust-colored shirt or a purple shirt, that's why. We're going to cover 2 different ways to put your pattern markings onto your fabric, 2 ways to pin the fabric together, and 2 ways to stitch the project close, or what they call finish it. So the finished size of these hand warmers is going to be 4 inches by 4 inches. As you know, if you've watched the videos up until now, if you followed along, or if you just know already, we also have to add seam allowance onto that. So as you're putting your pattern on your fabric, you can either mark where you need to cut, so that would be the seam allowance, right? The outside of the seam allowance, or you can mark where you are going to sew. There are a number of watch outs, pros and cons to each, and we will discuss that via voiceover as we watch. So first, I am doing 2 exactly 4 by 4 squares. Generally speaking, marking the stitch line is my preferred method, but there are some challenges with it. So one of those challenges is that you need to make sure that you are adding that seam allowance, that you're accounting for it as you're drawing your pattern on your fabric. You can't draw the pattern too close to the edge. It might feel really nice to not quote unquote waste that fabric, but you need that seam allowance, so it's not going to be wasted. You're going to use it. You also need to make sure that you kind of double that seam allowance between the 2 pieces, right? Because you're going to be cutting that in half to give seam allowance to one side and seam allowance to the other. Okay, so the measurements don't really matter for these, right? We just need to do 2 same size pieces of fabric that we're stitching together, and we need to ideally have consistent seam allowance lines. Honestly, if you're not consistent, if this does not end up like a square, if it ends up oblong or one side's puffier than the other, or there's a pleat or what, it doesn't matter. It's still going to hold rice, and provided we're using cotton fabrics and cotton thread, it's going to be microwavable. Congratulations, it's a rice sock or a hand warmer. What are we making? That's part of why I think this is such great exercise, because it lets you hone those skills while it doesn't matter. You know, like you can get it wrong and that's fine. And sometimes we learn more from getting it wrong, right? Like just go for it. Next, I'm going to use the blue marker. It doesn't matter, but I'm just doing it so that we can tell the difference. I'm using the blue marker to make pattern markings that are on the cut line. So if our finished pattern is going to be 4 inches by 4 inches and our seam allowance is 1/2 inch, that means on the left side we're adding 1/2 inch, on the top we're adding 1/2 inch, on the right side we're adding 1/2 inch, and on the bottom we're adding 1/2 inch. So top and bottom adding 1/2 inch each, that's 1 inch. Side to side adding 1/2 inch each, that's 1 inch. So we add 1 inch, and it's important to remember to double your seam allowance measurement, right? Because you don't want to just do 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches, then you're dealing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Math is fun! Generally speaking, I don't love just drawing the outside. I mean, for this especially, because it doesn't really matter, you know? One nice thing about it is that you can draw your pattern pieces right next to each other because you're not adding seam allowance. It's already accounted for in there. So here, I'm just drawing 2 5 by 5 squares, again, using my transparent ruler to get those right angles accurate. And again, it doesn't matter if you don't get it right or accurate, because who cares, as long as it's microwavable with the rice and doesn't burn people. Who cares? And it's about practice, right? Practice! What is that? Okay, no, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened to you. Next up, we cut the pieces out. Pretty straightforward. We need to make sure that we are cutting on the cut lines when that is how we've marked it, right? So here it's with the blue marker. And then we need to make sure that we are adding in seam allowance when we've only drawn the stitching lines. If you are super concerned about it, you can really do both. Draw the stitch line and draw the seam allowance line, and then I would recommend using different colors for each so that you're not confused and accidentally cutting on the wrong line. And then as you get more comfortable, you really could just mark one, you know, like you could fold the fabric in half and just mark one of them. And then you don't need to be as accurate with the bottom part because your marks are all on the top. You know, we'll get into that as we're stitching. It'll make more sense in a minute. So even though we have our stitch lines marked on the orange pattern, I went ahead and tried to even up what would be our seam allowance line to make sure that all of the seam allowances are approximately even. Now let's talk pinning. So of course on the orange pattern, it's going to be important that I line up the front and the back, right? We're going to go right sides together. If that does not make sense to you, watch my sewing jargon video. Starting in one of the corners, push the pin through one corner mark, like where the two lines meet, and then line it up with that same corner on the other side. They're squares. It doesn't matter. One of the corners, you know? And then make sure those two fabric pieces meet directly on the pin. Like make sure that there isn't pin space between those two holes because we need those two to line up. And then put your pin end back through the first side. So the two different ways to pin your pattern pieces together really involve the needle direction, whether you're going parallel to the direction you're stitching or perpendicular. Once you've lined up two corners, your choice then is to either put the end of the pin back through on the stitch line, which if what you've marked is the stitch line, that can be really helpful because if you kind of do it blindly where you poke through one side knowing you're on the stitch line and you see where you end up on the other side, if you ended up in the stitch line, great, your pattern's matching up. If you didn't, then you need to adjust how the pieces are laying together. So if you are running your pins parallel to your stitch line, your options there are either to pin outside of the stitch line or inside of the stitch line so that your needle will not go over your pins. But if you have a ball-headed pin, not a flat-headed pin, your presser foot's still gonna hit that. Or you can pin directly on your stitch line, which is what I did here. The challenge with that is that you need to be pulling the pins out as you go so that the needle has a place to stitch. You know, the pin isn't occupying the space where the needle needs to go. So when I am pinning on my stitch line, I make sure that the pointy part of the pin points towards where the needle will be coming from so that I can slide the pin out as my fabric is continuing to move towards the needle. Otherwise, you have to stop, pull your pin towards the needle, and then start stitching again and hope your fabric hasn't moved. So because we are going to turn these right side out, we are not going to machine stitch all the way around all four sides. We need to leave an opening. So that opening needs to be about 1.5 to 2 inches on one of our straight sides, not at a corner. But to remind myself not to just keep sewing all around, I make sure that I pin some pins in a different way that I'm stitching. Or here, I'm also using the ball-headed pins that I don't usually love. So even with my ADHD brain, as I'm going around, I can be like, wait, what's this guy? Oh, wait, stop. You know? Generally speaking, I prefer to pin perpendicular to my stitch lines. This is because if you have a very sharp needle, it is very rarely going to hit a pin. It will kind of slide off the rounded side of the pin because the part of the pin that's sharp is the tip. The around the pin is pretty smooth. However, the needle does occasionally hit the pin. Usually it breaks the pin. That's why all my pins are so messed up. But sometimes it does break the needle. So it is a risky run. I'm not afraid of changing needles. Neither should you be. I'll make a video someday. Let me know in the comments if you want it soon. Here is a time lapse of me filling a bobbin and threading my machine with my green cotton thread for this project. I have a whole video just about threading your bobbin and another entirely about threading your machine. Real time, this took me 3.5 minutes to do both. But while we watch this, I want to share just 2 more notes about pinning. This, I will say, is the area where I injure myself the most. They say in the costume shop that it's good luck to bleed on a garment. I don't like that. Just watch your fingers. Pinning can feel kind of personal, like the number of pins you feel like you want to use. Again, this is a great pattern to get it wrong on or learn that about yourself. Now, at long last, let's start sewing for real, for real. If you watched last week's video, then you're all set, ready to go. We've set our machine tension, and the last 2 settings are our needle placement and stitch length. For needle position, as we've discussed in past videos, the seam allowance guide numbers on the metal plate are accurate for center needle position. So if your needle is left or right adjusted, then you'll want to adjust how you are aligning your seam allowance on that guide accordingly. Unless you don't care, because again, you kind of can't mess this up. And then even if you do, it's a learning opportunity. Okay. And then for stitch length, I like to set my machine to about 2.5. I don't know if that's like millimeters or what, but most machines have settings from 1 to 4, and then anything below 1 is usually for buttonholes or specialty stitches. I use 4 when I'm doing kind of not permanent stitches, but for situations like this, I like to use a good old 2.5. So for stitching this project, the only rules are backstitch at the beginning and end and leave a non-minuscule opening on one of the straight sides. Other than that, it doesn't matter. If you want to sew the full 5 inches of length on each side, that's cool. If you want to just sew the actual pattern stitch lines, that's cool too. I'm showing you each option here. I generally prefer to stop on the corners, but it like legitimately doesn't matter. You'll see some optional trimming that we'll do a little later, but feel free to play around. This would be a great place to practice your accuracy. Something that I like to do a lot is I stitch up towards the corner. As I'm getting closer to the corner, I will ease off of the foot pedal and I'll start to use more of the manual turning of the knob on the side of the machine. So when we get the needle into the fabric right at the corner, the needle is down. You can lift your presser foot and turn your fabric using that down needle as an anchor point. You turn your fabric 90 degrees, put the presser foot back down, and keep on stitching. Because your needle was in the fabric, it was like mid-stitch. So you don't actually need to backstitch here because we're not beginning or ending. But I typically will reinforce the corner with some additional stitches. That's really what the extra stitches are doing. They're reinforcing themselves. But it's only really super important to backstitch in your first few stitches, otherwise they can come undone. If you don't start right before or after the opening we're leaving, like if you start on another side, then when you get to the part that we need to leave open, you can just skip over that chunk by lifting the presser foot up when your needle is not down and adjusting your fabric to where you want it to go, putting your presser foot back down to hold it in place, and then continuing to stitch there. Make sure that you backstitch before and after that opening. It's going to be so frustrating if you don't do that. That's really kind of the only important part of this whole project. Next, you'll trim your threads and remove your pins. You can remove the pins first or trim the threads first, whichever you prefer. Trim your threads wherever you have them. Definitely any start-stop points, anywhere you lifted your presser foot. When the needle was lifted, there will likely be some additional thread there. You do need to remove the pins, but for the thread part, I mean, you're just going to tuck it inside, so you also don't have to do this. It's just something that we'll do on other projects, so it's a good habit to get into. Next, I like to trim the corners, but I'm going to tighten up the seam allowance here a little bit. Not too much. Trust me, we need to keep the seam allowance. Since we're turning these inside out or right side out, depending on how you look at it, all of the seam allowance is going to live inside of the finished project. So everything that's outside is going to be shoved inside. You 1000% do not need to trim any of the seams, and you don't have to trim the corners. I'm just going to trim the corners so that they can be more square, so that the project will kind of lay more nicely. But if you want to try it both ways, don't cut the corners. Turn the project right side out. If you are fine with what it looks like, then go about your life. And if you're not fine with what it looks like, turn it back around, trim the corners, and then turn it right side out again. So to turn it right side out, we'll pull the fabric through the opening we left and sort of work the corners out. There are a few kinds of ways to do this. You can absolutely do it manually, but there is a tool called a point turner that's pretty inexpensive. It's only a few bucks. I'll be using it here for comparison just to show you the difference, which I think is negligible here, but really anything works. You could use like a capped pen or the eraser side of a pencil, just something that's pointy-ish, but not too sharp. We don't want to cut anything with a sharp, pointy thing. Just push the corners out, you know? Then we press the fabric. When we press it, the portion that we left open that's unstitched, since it was on a straight edge, it will press neatly like the rest of the project. And this is really the biggest reason why we're pressing this one, because that's going to kind of cheat our final seam line for us. You'll see. Then the last thing we do before we close them up is we fill them with about a 1/4 cup of dry rice. You can use more if you like. A 1/4 cup really isn't that much, but just note that the more you add, the bigger and heavier the final will be, which you might want, but it will also be harder to close. You'll see in a minute. If you don't have a funnel, you can just roll up a piece of paper to create a makeshift funnel, and if you do have a funnel, look at you! Be patient here, I promise. You would rather this take an extra minute for the rice to like funnel down through the paper or the funnel if you have one, la-di-da, than to spend a bunch of time cleaning up spilled rice. I don't know from experience or anything. Why? Once you've put your rice inside, throw a pin in the top portion so you know which way is open so you don't spill the rice out of that end. I actually did not make that mistake, but I also wasn't taking any chances. So my preferred method to close these is by hand. More on that later, but since this series is all about machine stitching, I'm going to show you how to close this by machine. You could just machine stitch close to the edge on the side with the opening, back stitching at the beginning and the end, but to make this more uniform, here I'm going to top stitch the entire way around the project. This is a little tricky. You may recall, we just filled this with rice. I have never sewn over rice, and I don't really want to find out what would happen, so I'm sort of jiggling the rice to the center and pinning around the edge. These pins are not to keep the fabric in place as much as it's to keep the rice in place away from our needle. Remember how I said it would be harder to close this with more rice added? This is why. Usually when I'm top stitching, it's not structural so much. I tend to do a basting stitch or a 4 stitch length. But for this, since we're also closing up a hole, I'm keeping my stitch length at 2.5. Also, since I want to get pretty close to the edge, and we've got a pouch full of rice, I'm moving my needle closer to the edge of the project, the left here, so I don't need to fit as much of the fabric under the presser foot. This can sometimes make the project a little more unruly. You'll just want to continue to guide it through, but you've already sewn around all 4 sides, so you're a pro. You got this. So because this top stitching will be visible, I did want to stop in the corners with the needle down, lift the presser foot up, turn the project, lower the presser foot, and continue stitching to give like one continuous line around. And if you don't want to do that, live your best life. I love that for you. I did backstitch at the beginning and end, especially on the side that was open, which is now no longer open. And that's it! Oh my goodness, you did it! Will you please celebrate yourself? If you've made it this far in the video, you are either my family member or you've just learned a whole bunch of new stuff. Think about how proud of you past you would be. I'm proud of you. There you go. You just put it in your pocket if you're gonna be outside for a while, or you can put it in your bed, down by your feet when it's cold. So next week we're gonna learn how to hand sew these clothes. It is hands down, although your hands will be up, the most commonly used by me hand sewing stitch. I use this, or a variation of this, for everything that I do that's not embroidery, I think. Next week I'll show you both how I hand stitch these clothes and also how I use the exact same stitch to heal up some busted loveys where the seams have ripped. I use it all the time. That's it. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please like this video. Please consider subscribing, and I'll see you next week. Bye! Future me again, but still past me to you because you're in the future of when I am now. Because time for us only moves in one direction. The 4th dimension only moves in one direction for us. So if you watched last week's video, then I think it's actually that way is how I point. It doesn't matter because that's not the dimension of time. That's not how time goes. But it should be that way though, right?